The family was joyfully taking a family photo. However, behind the photographer sat a black boy who had been adopted. Despite the father's objections, the mother insisted on having the boy join them for the photo. Mike was a bit surprised and stood awkwardly behind Mrs. Twosie. As the photographer clicked the shutter, the sturdy black boy felt the warmth of a family for the first time. At just 16, Mike was already close to 7 feet tall and weighed 300 pounds. One of his feet was larger than a girl's head. He had always been a loner because his mother was a drug addict, and he had never met his father. He had been wandering around for years, like a football being tossed around by more than a dozen adoptive families. One night, he heard his adoptive parents arguing loudly again, scolding him for eating too much and telling him to get out. In reality, these adoptive parents were just trying to get government subsidies. Mike was used to wandering. When he was hungry, up leftover popcorn, and when he was tired, he would sleep in the school gym. It wasn't until Mrs. Twosie came along that his life changed completely. A man rolled down the car window and asked him where he was going. Mike, shivering from the cold, said he was heading to the gym, but Mrs. Twosie noticed that he was walking in the opposite direction and couldn't bear to see him go. After all, the plastic bag he was carrying was all he had. Mrs. Twosie chased after him and asked why he had lied. Mike looked like a child who had done something wrong. Mrs. Twosie saw through his humble stubbornness and glanced back at her husband and son. She had made up her mind. Since the guest room was full of clutter, she had to let Mike stay on the sofa for the night and told him he could come upstairs to find her if he needed anything. But as soon as she got back to the room, she started to worry. A black boy from the ghetto. What if something bad happened? Mrs. Twosie felt guilty for taking him in because she was still worried that Mike might do something out of line. The next morning, she nervously went downstairs, only to find that Mike had left early and had neatly folded the sofa and bedding. She was stunned and felt ashamed of her doubts. She ran out to ask Mike to stay another day. She prepared a big meal, and her daughter even handed a plate to Mike. But he was afraid of being looked down upon for eating too much, so he only took a little fried rice and vegetables and quietly grabbed a small piece of bread. When everyone was comfortably lying on the sofa, watching the game and eating, Mrs. Twosie noticed that only Mike was sitting at the dining table, earnestly eating his Thanksgiving lunch. So she turned off the TV and asked everyone to come to the table for a pre-meal prayer. Her daughter reached out without hesitation, and her son quickly gestured to Mike as well. Mike was stunned because it was the first time someone had reached out to him. Mrs. Twosie was very pleased because it was Mike who made this Thanksgiving meaningful. She looked Mike up and down, feeling that something was missing, so she suggested taking him to buy some new clothes. But Mike, feeling inferior, refused, saying he had clothes and didn't need to buy any. They went to the black neighborhood where Mike used to live, but then she noticed that a few thugs were staring at Mrs. Twosie and making lewd jokes and gestures to Mike. Mike ignored them and walked straight to his mother's house, but when he got closer, he found that it had been forcibly repossessed by the court. He sat in the corner, his eyes gradually reddening because he knew he had been abandoned again.
She went home.
Well, we can come back.
Probably move to a nicer place.
Mrs. Twosie didn't understand what Mike was saying. The so-called better place, in Mike's words, was actually a polite guess because he knew his mother was a drug addict and could die at any time. However, this sentence of Mike's hid a great deal of sorrow. Mrs. Twosie failed to get Mike's clothes back, so she decided to buy him some. But she, who had never been to the black neighborhood before, clutched her bag tight with both hands. After shopping around the store, Mrs. Twosie was still not very satisfied because there were too few sizes that Mike could wear. Mrs. Twosie picked out a few pieces of clothing for Mike, but he said he didn't like any of them and finally picked up the cheapest one. In the evening, she couldn't help but ask Mike if he had ever thought about staying long-term.
You want to stay here, Michael?
I don't want to go anyplace else.
Mrs. Twosie learned from the school teacher that her husband had changed Mike's emergency contact to their family. She smiled and found out that Mike's academic performance was at the bottom of the state, but he ranked in the top 2 in the state in one test, which was protective awareness. At this time, Mrs. Twosie didn't realize that Mike had a very high talent in a certain sport, and this unique talent would completely change his fate in the future. The next day, Mrs. Twosie cleared out a room for Mike. Since she couldn't buy a bed frame of the right length, she had it custom made. Looking at the scene in front of her, Mike was stunned. She locked eyes with Mike, but quickly looked away because she couldn't imagine that a boy had been abandoned by so many adoptive families over the years and didn't even have a bed of his own. Mrs. Tuosi always presented herself as a strong woman, but Mike's tragic experiences hurt her heart again and again. Mike seemed clumsy, but had delicate emotion. He heard Mrs. Tuosi's sobs and wanted to go in and comfort her, but in the end, he chose not to disturb her. However, there was still someone quietly caring for Mike in the background. From the first class, the female teacher at school noticed Mike's uniqueness. Although he didn't write a single word on his test paper, he drew a small boat on the back, and the person on the boat was Mike himself, symbolizing his great pain and loneliness in a white school. When other teachers complained that Mike had intellectual problems, the righteous female teacher stood up again. Prejudice is an invisible wall, and love and understanding are the morning light that penetrates it. The female teacher was like Mike's morning light. She always kept Mike after school and patiently tutored him one-on-one. Mike gradually opened his heart to her, and his academic performance slowly improved. Under the influence of the female teacher, other teachers also joined her. They were touched by this pure kindness, let go of their prejudices against Mike, and regained confidence. That night, the family went out for dinner. After learning that Mr. Sean had 85 restaurants, Mike was not surprised but felt regretful.
Well, we have to throw some of it out when it's already cooked.
That's too bad.
Yeah, I'd rather sell it.
I feel like you could give it away or something. We should check into that, Daddy.
Mike's kindness subtly changed his younger brother. It was precisely because of his kind nature that Mrs. Tuosi made a significant decision later on. When they were about to go home, Mike saw a familiar figure. He quickly went up to confirm and hugged the person tight. On the way home, Mrs. Tuosi couldn't help but ask who the child he had hugged was. Mike hadn't seen his brother for years, but recognized him at first sight. They had the same tragic childhood, being half-brothers. Mike longed for family bond. Compared to his brother, he was fortunate. During his time living with the Tuosis, Mike studied diligently, made great progress, and got a tryout opportunity with the school's football team. However, as a newcomer, he not only couldn't understand the rules, but also had trouble comprehending the coach's instructions.
Shut the blocker. Don't hold him. Go. No.
To get Mike into the game, his younger brother personally started training him. Thinking his brother was just playing around, Mike was taken aback when he said seriously, "Don't let everyone down." His brother was very strict with Mike, who never thought of giving up. Their relationship grew even closer. As Mike got closer to the Tuosi family, rumors reached Mrs. Tuosi's ears. At a gathering, friends made jokes about Mike without any restraint, saying he looked like King Kong and could eat his husband's restaurant out of business in one meal. Mrs. Tuosi just smiled it off, but the arrogant ladies only became more outrageous.
Hey, you're changing that boy's life.
No. He's changing my life.
That's awesome for you. What about Collins?
What about Collins?
Aren't you worried? I mean, even just a little? He's a boy, a large black boy, sleeping under the same roof.
Shame on you.
It was true that Mrs. Tuosi had changed Mike's life, but she hadn't considered her daughter's feelings. So she seriously asked her daughter if she felt uncomfortable living under the same roof with Mike. However, her daughter was much more mature than she had imagined. Her response surprised her and further solidified her plans. One day, the sister unexpectedly saw Mike getting along well with some little girls at school, revealing his gentle side. When classmates were afraid to sit with Mike, she was the first to stand up, ignoring the strange looks and sitting with him. That evening, Mike approached Mrs. Tuosi and said he wanted a driver's license. She questioned him, saying he didn't even have a car, so why did he need a license? Mike replied that he just wanted a piece of identification to prove who he was. They went to the local department to check, only to find that there was no record of Mike in the system. So she went home and discussed it with her husband, deciding to let Mike become a legal member of their family. However, while going through the adoption procedures, Mrs. Tuosi learned about Mike's tragic childhood for the first time through the agency's records. He had never met his father, and the only thing he knew about him was that he had committed suicide, jumping off a bridge in the middle of the night. His mother was a drug addict addict who had given birth to more than 10 children. With no income, they had forcibly taken Mike away from his mother when he was very young. As a mother herself, Mrs. Tuosi decided to visit Mike's mother. The first time she saw the woman, she was extremely haggard and frail. When she learned that Mrs. Tuosi wanted to adopt Mike, her words were filled with self-reproach. When Mrs. Tuosi asked about Mike's background and his real name,
Would you like to see him? No, not this way. It's Williams. His last name's Williams. Couldn't even remember who the boy's father is.
she couldn't help but burst into tears. Mike's father had left them just a week after he was born. She was moved by Mrs. Tuosi's sincerity and agreed to the adoption. Mrs. Tuosi also firmly shook her hand. True strength does not lie in confrontation or salvation, but in seeing others' vulnerabilities and offering gentle support. After obtaining Mike's mother's consent, the Tuosi family formally asked Mike if he would like to become a part of their family. Mike instinctively looked at his sister and then at his brother beside him. From that moment on, Mike had his first piece of identification in his life. After obtaining his driver's license, his father also gave him a pickup truck. Mike excitedly took his brother out for a drive, but encountered an accident at an intersection. When Mrs. Tuosi arrived, she found that the front of the car was already deformed. Mike was deeply filled with guilt. However, his brother only suffered minor injuries. The staff told Mrs. Tuosi that it was a miracle because, at the moment the airbag was triggered, with such a violent impact, the brother in the passenger seat would have been either dead or severely injured. Dangerous moment. It must have been God reached out and protected the brother from harm. Mrs. Tuosi was just relieved to have been blessed by God until she saw Mike's injured right arm and suddenly realized